It's right on time. So there we go. Welcome everyone to Tile 101. The three of us up here are going to try and give you a bit of a sort of baseline, well-rounded idea of how to specify and how to get more tile into your specifications and have them be successful for the life of the project for your client. So just housekeeping, make sure you got your badge scanned. I know they're on point with that, but make sure you do if you need some credits for this session, and make sure you got your cell phones turned off, otherwise we get to take them home with us. Yeah, so we're each going to just give you a little bit of a preamble. My name is Ryan Fazan. I'm the technical consultant for Tile of Spain. I've been working in the tile industry for 30 years now. I started when I was 13, doing just about everything. I've been in product development. I now build houses as well and do a lot of technical work with the industry, consulting with manufacturers.
I'm Elena Capra. I'm a certified master kitchen and bath designer as well as an interior designer, and I also work as a spokesperson with coverings. So I've been designing about 21 years, so for me, specifying tile has been something I've been doing since day one, and I'm going to be bringing you the designer perspective in our conversation today.
Cool, and my name is Scott Conwell. I'm an architect. I'm with International Masonry Institute. I also sit on the Tile Council of North America Handbook Committee and the ANSI Standards Committee that develops the standards. So by show of hands, how many of you are interior designers or architects or design professionals of some nature? Couple, okay. Suppliers, distributors, manufacturers, raise your hand. Okay. Contractors or installers? So about an even split. All right, perfect. I think that this will be a well-balanced discussion. We've got Elena on the design side, Ryan, technical consultant, and an architect. So let's jump right in. We want to first talk about what types of tile are on the market, generically speaking, and what sets one tile apart from another. So I think we all know what a tile is, but this is the official definition from the ANSI standard, ANSI A137.1. You're going to learn more about the ANSI standards today than you probably wanted to, but it's important to know the type of information that can be found in the standards. So a tile, what ANSI tells us is that each type of tile has specific physical properties and characteristics. And that's really what sets apart a mosaic from a quarry tile to a pressed floor to a glazed wall tile and a porcelain tile. Those are the 5 types of tile that ANSI A137.1 addresses in the manufacturing standard. So when I say the manufacturing standard, that's the standard that talks about the properties, the physical properties, and the aesthetic properties of these individual types of tile. So within the A137.1, they refer you to tables 6 through 10 if you want to learn more information about any one of those types of tile. So just to make sure you all understand, these are not the only 5 types of tile. There's also, of course, glass tile, stone tile, and a different kind of porcelain called gauged porcelain. We'll talk about that a little bit. But those are described elsewhere in different standards. So back to tables 6 through 10. I just threw the table up on the screen so you can see the type of information. We're not going to talk at length about too much of this. But let's start with mosaic tile. A mosaic tile is defined according to its size. It's any tile that is less than 9 square inches. All right, so a mosaic tile could be a stone tile, it could be a glass tile, it could be a porcelain tile, and it's often one of those. But before it's any of those, it's considered a mosaic tile. And so we consult table 6 to learn the properties of mosaic tile. We consult table 7 to learn more about quarry tile. What makes a quarry tile unique is it goes through an extrusion process during its manufacture rather than a pressing process. And Ryan's going to talk about why that's important when he gets into some of the manufacturing techniques. Third down the line, we have a pressed floor tile. We see a lot of pressed floor tile. It falls a little bit short of being a porcelain tile because a pressed floor tile does not have the absorptive characteristics or the non-absorptive characteristics of a porcelain, but it's still a very good, durable tile for many flooring applications. And of course, you can use a floor tile on a wall, but you would never want to use a wall tile on a floor. So pressed floor tile, it's a pretty good versatile tile. Glazed wall tile, you would only put this on a wall. When we talk about aesthetic characteristics, one of the things about a glazed wall tile is you've got a very consistent look, or you can have if that's what you're going for. So that orange tile on the screen, it's very consistent from tile to tile. And then finally we get to porcelain tile. This is the workhorse of the industry for most commercial installations. It's the most durable. It's in the impervious category when we think about moisture absorption, meaning that it's really good for freeze-thaw applications if you're using it in exterior applications. And much of porcelain tile is manufactured with rectified edges, and you can get a more exacting grout joint, and we'll talk more about that later.
So we thought at this point it would be beneficial to just sort of talk about some of the baseline characteristics of tile and why people would be looking to incorporate it more into specifications. And that's really relevant today for a lot of reasons because of these inherent characteristics. But before we get into that, I really want to kind of showcase that ceramic tile is one of the best forms of biomimicry that we've ever come up with as a species. Biomimicry is just taking the Earth's natural processes, nature's natural processes, and figuring out a way to imitate them to create similar results. Basically, the way the Earth makes stone is taking natural minerals, intense pressure within the Earth's crust, and heat from the Earth's mantle, fusing all those minerals together to create stone. That's exactly what we do when we are creating ceramic tile. And basically, these four main components, Scott's going to get a lot more detail into the components that go into tile, but these are the highest percentage components that go in every tile that we as a species have made in the past 4,000 years. In fact, what we know about a lot of our history as a species is because of recovered material that is ceramic. It's one of the only things that survives eons of degradation, basically, because of its durability. So we've got recovered shards from ancient Egypt all the way through Mesopotamia and Assyria. And what we know about those cultures is largely from the material, in ceramic material that we've recovered. And where technology is going today, once we get through to the technology section, you're going to see that our capabilities are able to reproduce exactly those up to 3,000-year-old tile. One of the things that I love in talking to specifiers or new people coming into the industry is that being wholly transparent with ceramics is completely easy because there's literally no externalities. There's nothing that we don't factor into the sustainable or performance characteristics of our product. If you look up there, there's so many things that are relevant to consumers today that touch on sustainability, health and safety, and longevity of projects, as well as keeping budgets in place for clients when you talk about the lifespan of a building. So ceramics really have so many points that are deep connection points for consumers today. The industry is also getting really, really good at providing all kinds of resources from trade association websites like tilespainUSA.com, tcna.com, and the Why Tile initiative. There's all sorts of material compare and contrast tools. One of the best ones I've found is the Bees program. It's an online tool that's free to use, and you can contrast tile versus literally almost any other cladding material that you're wanting to put into your buildings. And something that I'm seeing emerging more and more is indigenous wisdom applied to the built environment and how sustainable practices of indigenous cultures around the world can apply to modern architecture as well. So there's all kinds of resources out there that can bring all of these aspects into your specifications. One of the things that's really important for clients to understand is that tile is 100% natural. There's no synthetics, there's no chemicals that go into the making of our products, and there's zero VOCs. And it truly offers a holistic benefits, which Elena's going to get into when we're talking about specifications. So one of the things that I love talking about this decade is this is really kind of the face of this decade is, oh yeah, convince me. And we're going to talk about that because, as I said, like tile has no externalities, so it's really easy for this industry to be transparent, and I'm going to pass it off to Scott to talk about what we're doing in this industry in regards to transparency.
Thanks, Ryan. So we have to understand what's in this material that we're selling or installing or designing with. This chart is taken from the Material Ingredient Guide that was recently published by the Tile Council of North America, and it's an industry average. These are the components that go into the tile and the approximate percentages. Every manufacturer is going to be a little bit different, but these are the approximate percentages. So when we look at tile, we have to look at the raw materials and ask ourselves, are these materials toxic for the environment? Are they toxic on human beings? What is their relative level of toxicity as compared with other flooring products or finishing products that we could be specifying? And it's a very, very important question to ask, is how does our material compare to other materials? So transparency, I love the definition that the AIA has assigned to transparency. It's when manufacturers disclose the environmental, health, and social impacts of their products. The more information, the better. And we're looking for manufacturers to really put it all out there and tell us what it is that they're selling. And we've made great strides, which you'll see in a minute. And it's important because then designers can optimize their choices, and the manufacturers can also optimize their production techniques and their raw materials if they know that some of their materials may be harmful, for example. So transparency is important for those reasons. You know, we just need to make good choices. We're also incentivized. When I say we, building owners, designers are incentivized by some of these sustainability rating programs like LEED and Well Building and others for reporting the material ingredients in all of the materials that go into a building. So we don't specify safe materials because we get LEED points. We specify them because it's the right thing to do. But the LEED rating systems and the other ones are a good measure of that. So the actual document, the Material Ingredient Guide, it's a free download from the Tile Council's website. And I really encourage you, it's 30 to 40 pages long. It's pretty meaty, and there's a lot of really good information in there. I've read it, and I encourage you to read it. And it helps manufacturers to communicate with the architect or with the designer what their tile contains. Right? So who wrote this Material Ingredient Guide? I already told you it's on the Tile Council's website, but it was written collectively by all of these tile manufacturers and setting material manufacturers that you see on the screen. So it's a pretty comprehensive document, the Material Ingredient Guide. We're not going to talk too much about EPDs, but know that there are also collectively developed environmental product declarations on the TCNA website. So the Material Ingredient Guide really takes a deep look at what's in the tile and evaluates each of the ingredients on a green screen scale. The 4 being the best, 1 to 4, the higher number being better. Okay, so that's the backbone of the Material Ingredient Guide. So looking at a tile, for example, Ryan already said tiles made up of feldspar, or maybe you didn't say this yet, but you will. Feldspar, clay, silica, and a few other things. But let's take feldspar, which is a pretty major ingredient in most types of tile. We can't just say, oh, feldspar is feldspar. No, we have to look at what is the feldspar made of, and to its very basic level. So feldspar contains quartz, aluminum oxide, calcium oxide, potassium oxide, sodium oxide. Do you need to know this? Not really, but you need to know that this type of information is being evaluated and looked at and analyzed ultimately by the clients and the procurement managers and people who are interested in the materials we're specifying. Similarly, mortar contains Portland cement as well as other ingredients, but what does Portland cement contain? It contains all of these, some of the ones that you see on the screen. So if you take a look at the Material Ingredient Guide, or step back, let's take a look at a manufacturer inventory report. And I'm not going to tell you whose report this is, but this is a report of a setting material manufacturer, and they are disclosing all of the ingredients, well, most of the ingredients. Some of them they say it's a trade secret, and that's fine. They don't have to tell you everything they're using. They don't really have to tell you anything. We want them to, and they're starting to because we're starting to hold their feet to the fire. So this is a good example of transparency. It's a good example of a producer telling you what's in their material. So I mentioned the green screen rating system is the backbone of the Material Ingredient Guide, and the higher the number, 1 through 4, the safer the chemical or the ingredient is. So a red would be the worst thing. We avoid red materials at all costs. Orange would be barely permissible, but let's look for something safer in terms of health and environmental toxicity. Yellow, we're getting there. The goal is to specify materials, if we can, that contain only green or as much green number 4 of the ingredients as possible. So this is a really handy reference that the Tile Council came up with that shows the ingredients in tile. It's just kind of a quick reference compared with the ingredients in some of the other competing building materials. And you can see that tile has much, in general, has much safer materials. All right, that's all on ingredients. Any questions on material ingredients? All right, let's move on to something maybe a little bit more relatable. Sizing, edges, and visual criteria. All right, so when a manufacturer makes these tiles, before they can ever package them up and sell them, they have to be looked at and for facial defects and structural defects. If the tile contains structural defects, it cannot be sold. Cannot be sold. If it contains facial defects, it can be sold under certain circumstances. So what are these facial defects? They're pinholes, chips, scratches, etc. But how do we really evaluate these tiles? And ANSI tells us a very regimented procedure. So an array of those tiles are mounted to an easel of that size, and it's supported a board, and the board is supported by an easel at 70 degrees at a certain elevation. There's a certain light fixture, a certain dimension from the easel, and an individual with perfect vision who's not colorblind stands 3 feet away, and there's usually a timekeeper in the room, and looks at those tiles and examines them for visual defects. And that individual has 6 seconds per square foot to view that tile. And if there are no defects, it passes and it can go on to have further structural testing, and it can be sold as a first grade or a standard grade tile, which is the best of all tiles. Now what happens if you do notice visual defects from 3 feet? Well, the tile kind of gets a second chance, so to speak. So the individual now can back up to 10 feet and evaluate that same tile for the same set of visual criteria. Finding none, it can be sold as a second grade tile, which is going to be probably not as expensive, but also not as easy to work with. And we'll talk about some of the practical criteria. So here's an example of a carton of tile, and you can see the label. Manufacturers are required to disclose on their packaging whether their material in that package is a standard grade, which is the best, or a second grade tile. All right. So if you're selling tile, you should make a big deal that, hey, my tile, or this tile that I want you to buy, is a standard grade tile. It's an important distinction. We also have aesthetic classes defined in the ANSI manufacturing standard, V0 through V4. And I alluded to this earlier, if you're after, or if your client is after a perfect consistency, you would want to provide one of those V0. I have never found a V0. I've looked on the internet. If you find one, tell me. But really, V1 is about as exacting as we can get. Whereas a V3 and a V4, those are not necessarily inferior, but they're just going to be more of a variety of textures and colors and tones in that product. Elena's going to talk about this further, but mock-ups are super important when you want to manage the expectations of the end user. So certainly don't select tile from an image. It's always a good idea to dry lay tile to make sure that you're okay with the range of colors and textures. So many of us have heard the term rectified tile, but do you really know what that means? And here are the official definitions of rectified, which is the most precise, calibrated, which is in the middle of the road, and then natural, which is all over the place in terms of regularity, squareness, warpage, things like that. So a rectified tile is going to be the most consistently manufactured, and that table's kind of jacked up. But the pressed floor tile comes in each of those 3 varieties. Porcelain only comes in rectified or calibrated. So this is an example on the right of a rectified tile. You see how nice and straight that edge is? That's because it was cut and squared after it was fired in the kiln. Whereas calibrated, the raw materials are put together, they're pressed usually, if there's a glaze to be applied, and then it goes through the kiln, and there's an incredible amount of shrinkage that happens when that is fired but we can predict the shrinkage. Manufacturers can predict the shrinkage, and then it's just packaged and shipped. So calibrated is, you're always going to vary a little bit more with the calibrated tile than you will with the rectified tile, as illustrated by that top example. Right? Manufacturers, in other words, are allowed to provide you a tile that's a little smaller or a little bigger than what you expect it to be. Okay? Same is true with thickness. Same is true with flatness. Tiles are allowed to be warped, not by a lot, not by the amount that you see on the slide, but you get the idea, right? And tiles are allowed to be a little bit out of square. And this is where the installer's skills, even the best installers in the world, may not be able physically to give you a satisfactory installation if you're working with tile, if they're working with tile that has been manufactured to something less than ANSI A137.1. So it's very important to understand that ANSI A137.1 not only has the physical criteria, but the aesthetic, and that it is going to impact the project. So the picture is a 5-gallon bucket with the level across it, and there's there's a tile that's upside down on that cross of that bucket. And he showed me this picture on his phone, and I drew this arc so you can see that he was showing me that you could see daylight underneath that tile. The tile was far from flat enough, and it was impossible to lay without resulting in a huge amount of lippage. This tile was a substitution from the tile specified. The tile specified was an ANSI A137.1 tile, but the owner thought they could save a lot of money by importing tile from a country that doesn't have the same ANSI standards we do. Same tile setter, Froggy, same job, same phone. Another issue, the same tile was not square. So huge, huge headache for the installer. So I'm going to hand it to Elena while I just kind of finish my remark, is that please understand that what you're selling, you know, a successful project starts with good material. And then Elena and her peers on the design side have to take that really good material and do what with it, Elena?
We have to specify it and use it in our projects. Tile, as a designer, I think one of the most exciting materials to work with is tile, because it could be used in so many different applications in so many different ways. Indoors, outdoors, for residential, commercial, hospitality, and pools, and there's so many great uses for it. And as a designer, it's like being a kid in a candy store when you get to come and specify beautiful tile. So when it becomes that time to think about how you're going to be using it in your own project, I feel like you really need to hone in first on where is it being used, right? Because that's going to lead you to looking at the right collections, the right manufacturers, the right brands of people who could satisfy that need. If you're doing a space that's going to have indoor to outdoor seamless look, you're going to want to be looking for stuff that's going to have an outdoor tile, something that's the same for the interior and stuff like that. So always when you're approaching the design, to think about each area it's going to be used makes it a lot easier to kind of narrow down where you're going with that. Couple of things always from the beginning when we are specifying, whether it's for clients and projects, never specify from one sample piece. I mean, I feel like there are certain types of tile you can do that with, but as tile gets bigger, we're specifying panels and slabs, we're doing wood porcelain planks, things that have variation. If you're just looking at one piece, one plank, one look, that could be a surprise that you might not realize is going to end up being a problem down the road if you don't really look at every part, every face. So I always suggest, we love looking at the manufacturer's installed photos and seeing it in multiple uses and applications to really see that variation and make sure the end user is aware of all of that as well. And then if you needed multiple samples to indicate all of that color. Grout is definitely not an afterthought in the design process. And when we're designing and specifying the tile, very early on, I love looking at grouts, especially as you see in this picture here. This was a project we were working on where we wanted really good color coordination with the grout. Sometimes you're contrasting it for popping that pattern or going darker because it's a high traffic area and it's going to maybe in time get a little bit darker. But there are times in your design you want it to look consistent and beautiful, especially with some mosaics. And so we always like to design with that in mind, and we're referencing several different brands and always looking at all of that when we're selecting and specifying those tile. Also considering when we're using it in certain areas, if we're looking at a certain type of tile, maybe it's a 3D tile, or how we're going to finish that edge. Just things to consider as we continue to build the design to specify and point people towards that right product if you are selling it as well. Mixing materials of different thicknesses is another thing when you're specifying and putting multiple tiles together to create one space. Here, this was a bathroom that we designed for a client at my firm, and they really wanted to have these sort of inlay looks of this mother of pearl. And we were using a very large format porcelain on the walls. It was 24 by 48. So in order to use this very thin mosaic, it was very thin. We had to do several meetings with the installer and make sure that they were going to be able to get that so it would be flush and make the cuts right. It took a lot more effort to create this. Just on paper it works, but often when there's a lot of different thicknesses you're working with, those conversations also with your installers, and I'm going to touch on that later, need to happen early. And even when you're picking and selecting the materials, start considering, how is this going to work? Is this all going to tie together well? So this turned out beautiful, and I absolutely have, if you're newer to specifying, don't fear mixing those different things. Just have the conversations with the installers so everyone is on the same page to ensure that beautiful end result, which is what we are always going for. So the different types of tile when we're looking at specifying, of course, we touched on mosaics earlier, the different types of mosaic, whether you're doing custom murals and things like that. Sometimes those are sold differently. Sometimes they are paper facing on certain types of murals still. So it depends really on how that goes. You want to know these things. Where is it being installed? And of course, the grout with the mosaic, I think, is one of the most important things because that completely changes the look of the mosaic. I sometimes like a high contrast with the pattern. Sometimes here in this one, we wanted it to disappear. So you really need to think about that. This was a beautiful mural we had installed at Covering some years ago, and that just showcases the end result. I love mosaic murals. As a designer and specifying, I think this is that one thing that you can really have a lot of fun with. And the larger format tile, same thing. Consider where it's being used. This is, again, another case where those smaller sample pieces may not be enough. If it has a lot of veining, if it's really a pattern tile, or maybe there's an ombre, there's so many different types of tile, of the looks, that you want to really see the whole thing. So this is another one in those, just the piece for showing color, matching the other items, bringing it all together. It's not always easy to carry around a 24 by 48 tile in your car when you're going and looking at other showrooms and mixing and matching. So smaller pieces for matching, but look at the big picture. When you get to the gauge porcelain panels and slabs, that's also that same conversation about just having a small piece, but always seeing the large. And with this, sometimes maybe not everyone would be on display where you're looking, but always important to see those installed photos from the manufacturer to really get the look. If it has veining, you might be book matching, you might be doing continuous vein. There's several faces. Thinking about all of those things in advance. And of course, with these, working with a qualified installer to truly ensure that great end result. The smaller format tiles, similar to the mosaic where that grout is, again, a big thing, and considering the thicknesses of that. Now, when ordering, always another key, sometimes they say 10%, sometimes 15% overage. Sometimes we do 20. And I know that there's standards that some people will always do. I always talk to my installer in advance, talk about the type of tile we're using, talk about the pattern, because sometimes you do need more. And I think as a specifier, even as a designer, there's nothing worse than being short tile when it's being installed, especially if the lead time is long. You don't want to have to deal with that. So I think more is more sometimes, and it's always good to have extra on hand. So I like to err on the cautious side with that, but installers are key as well. Another thing that I do a lot that helps is before I know that install might begin, I sometimes will call and I'll ask them to check stock. Sometimes this is helpful, especially if there's longer lead times and you think you might be on that side where you might end up needing extra, or they might add something. Sometimes there's a little peace of mind in that, just knowing that that particular vendor might have that in stock. So if you did need, you could still get it. And again, best to know the square footage at the time of when you're specifying too. If your project has a lead time, that might be quicker. Sometimes you have a lot of time in the planning with specification. Sometimes you do not. So wasting time pulling things that you can't get right away, knowing I might need 1,000 square feet for this, 150 of this, I think sometimes helps. And when I'm working with showrooms, I find it easier because we're able to quickly check on those things, build a great plan, build the quote, get everything ready, and it makes it a lot easier. So we're going to jump into some other design stuff when it comes to installation, but we're going to turn it over to Ryan for production and technology.
Yeah, I get a couple of minutes here to just sort of give you guys an idea of what the manufacturing sector goes through, to give you all of the tools that you need to have a successful installation. And what I hope this is going to give you is an idea that the manufacturing sector really sort of conceptualizes where you're going to be using these products and developing products specifically for those areas and use cases for your clients. I didn't put a slide in here for this, but it's one pro tip that I always tell when I'm talking to an American audience, is that the industry and the machinery for the industry works on the metric system. Even though all of our product that we see on the floors here is talked about in imperial measurements, and we've got 24/48s and everything else, those are nominal in this industry. So that means they're approximate. This industry works on the metric system when it comes to tile sizes. So always, 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 especially if you're doing detailed installations where you want those inlays to land at a certain spot, work back from the metric and transfer that to actual imperial. It's the most important thing. If you're an installer, me and my crew, we work on metric tapes. And we do our layouts based on metric because it's just easier than doing the conversion. So before I start into my segment, that's just one pro tip I wanted to give you guys. End of the day, what we do as designers, as salespeople, as technicians in the industry is try to find a solution for a problem. And that solution evolves with our technology. So our solution gets better as technology progresses. And today in this industry, in terms of production technology, it has been an exponential hockey stick of what we're seeing in terms of our capabilities. And I'm going to give you a bit of a showcase on that. So we're going to talk about how we form the tile, and first the body, the substrate of the tile itself, because that's the first area that we start in terms of what it's going to be applied for, how you guys can use that in your specifications. When I used to do Tile 101s, about a decade ago, it was all about porosity. Now it's really all about how the formation method, what we do in pressing the tile. Because we have three major forming methods, I'm going to go through each of those. There's dry press, there's lamina, and there's extrusion. And we do those three different methods for three very specific reasons. And there's pros and cons of each of them, and we're going to walk through each of those. I'm starting with dry press because this is probably 70 to 80% of the tile that you see on the floor here at the fair. It's the broadest range of tile production that we do. And basically, this is a punch. It's a stainless steel punch that these rubber impression molds go in. One side of the punch moves down to accept the clay, and the other side punches it and pushes all the air out and presses it into the shape. And then that gets pushed out and moves on down the line and continues. So basically, this style of production has got a lot of strengths. It's why it's the broadest range in the industry. It's very porosity flexible. We can do things from a 20% and higher porosity wall tile all the way down to a 0.5 and lower porcelain tile. So all of our products can be made with this production category, basically. It's very edge profile flexible as well, meaning we can do calibrated, natural, and rectified tile in this style. We can vary the thickness of this tile as well, and a lot of progressive manufacturers are trying to slim down the thickness of their tile because it's much more efficient, especially for us here in the US. Landed cost is about 40 to 50% of the actual cost of the tile is in shipping. So the more we can load into a can, the more cost effective it is. It's available to the most broadly and cost-effective range of mortars. Now, in terms of drawbacks, the one thing to note about this style of tile is the way this press works. It has tension within the body all arcing toward the center, so there's an inherent camber in all of these tiles. It always crowns in the center of the tile, and that's generally why we don't specify any kind of offset more than a third of a tile in a larger format. So anything with a facial dimension larger than 16 inches. So if you want any kind of offset look in a larger format, You want to look outside this style of tile generally. So I think I've covered pretty much everything here. And we're going to move on to lamina, which is probably the newest style of production. It's where the gauge porcelain segment comes. It's where our largest formats come. It's very sustainably focused because we do all of our cutting and all of our size gradation before we fire, so any waste material can get reintroduced to the production stream, because as soon as we fire it, it's much harder to reutilize that material. So this is where we get our largest formats, up to 5.5 by 11 foot slabs and panels generally. The profiles range from about 3.5 to 4 millimeters all the way up to 20 millimeters in thickness. Often we can do a lot of off-site fabrication, so for modular builds, things like prefab housing, this is a great material to go to. And this is where we get into a completely flat, zero camber process, because basically this is like the compaction that we do for asphalt. It's basically two wheels that push this material out. So all of the tension within that body is in one dimension, so it is perfectly flat, or as close to as we can get. Some of the drawbacks to keep in mind are maneuverability, especially with these larger formats. I think we were talking as we were building this presentation, I'm not the only one that's come into this issue. We actually had to take walls out of a building and get the material craned in because there was no way to move it around the internal stairways, and that was something that wasn't thought about by the specifier. So, you know, a lot of the time when I'm working with this kind of product in my houses that we're actually doing the installation, we'll do this before boarding is done. So if we're doing walls and floors, we'll board just the area so we can move around the studs and we can get this material into the space much easier. Now in innovations, we're doing like through body decoration today, where we're digitally applying body stains to the material, so it's not just the surface. We can fabricate it just like stone. Think about this for furniture and millwork when you're adding and you're wanting to increase tile outside of traditional floors and walls. The last one that I want to talk about is just like your pasta makers or Play-Doh machines, is extruding wet clay material through a shaped die. And this is an incredibly flexible material. It's where we get our quarry tile from because it's extremely dense, but it's also the best way to create sharp-edged shapes like that pointed cross. We can't do that in a dry press because those sharp edges break as they're pushing out of the press. It's also how we get those three-dimensional profiles, things like stair tread edging and any kind of coping, or anytime we want a high 3D relief tile is when you want to go to this. Also, structural things like that headboard that we see back there, we're doing like brise soleils and all kinds of different brise blocks in this kind of production method, and it lets you do unbelievable exterior hardscapes and pool installations as well. So this is kind of where you want to go for those. So moving beyond body, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we decorate the surface. And obviously one of the most huge innovations in the industry was the advent of digital decoration with inks. That was actually debuted in about 25 years ago now, in the year 2000. This shows the progression of where we're at, but basically we can print so much more than color today, and that's where our realism is coming from. Because if you look at the CMYK there is the center of color space, you can see that's actually the smallest sort of version of color space. As soon as we get into the visual spectrum and reflectivity outside of actual colors, that starts taking into account all of color space. And I think this really showcases why. When we read the color of this image, it's blue water, it's sandy colored beaches, it's green grass. But when we actually drill down and we look at light reflectivity in that surface, this is the array of colors in nature. And this is what it takes to create a believable surface. And this is where we're at in the ceramic industry now. Because we can print texture, reflectivity, different metallics, and using different frits to enhance the colors we're printing on the surface, we're able to create true, actual, natural realism where you can feel, see, and touch the realistic surfaces. So we've gone so far beyond photorealism, and it's something that I encourage you guys to use in your websites and in your talks with your clients. If you're looking at a face-on picture even of tile, that doesn't tell anywhere close to half the story anymore. You really need to look at oblique angles and get macro shots, or better yet, video, when you're assessing modern products and their realism. So I'll pass it on to Scott to talk about getting these things actually in projects.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Let's pause and see if anybody has any questions for Ryan on that section. Okay. All right, so we've talked pretty much all so far about tile. Now we're going to talk about something that's not tile. It's equally as important as the tile, and that is the substrate, is what you're putting the tile on. So when we think of an assembly, whether it's a wall or a floor, and this diagram actually applies to either one, we've got the backing assembly and we've got the finish assembly or the tile assembly. So the backing assembly is made up of the structure and the substrate, and then the tile assembly is typically what the tile contractor or the tile installers will come in and put their material over the substrate. So this term substrate is very, very important, and it's often debated, and I don't remember a time that we didn't talk about substrates on a job, at an ANSI meeting, at a tile council meeting. It is highly contested. What's a good substrate? How come this other trade gave us a substrate that wasn't suitable for our tile? And it's a very, very important topic. So it warrants some consideration and some discussion here. So with the ANSI standards, this A108 is the ANSI standard not for tile, but for the installation of tile. And what it tells us about substrates is that tile can be installed directly over a sound, clean, and dimensionally stable substrate. Okay. So some examples of suitable substrates are anything that's rigid, for example, for the most part, concrete block, cement board. When we get into wet areas like showers and intermittently wet areas like locker rooms, submerged areas like swimming pools and water features, then we have to pay a lot more attention to the qualities of the substrate in terms of their ability to resist moisture. But that's a little bit more detailed than we're going to talk about today. But I want you to understand, first of all, that some substrates are suitable, some are not, some are only suitable for non-wet areas. So let's look at cement board, or just more generally a backer board. Okay, a few things we need to have are backer board on framing, whether it's steel stud or wood stud framing. It has to be stiff, right? This backing has to be stiff enough so that the finished tile installation does not deflect, and the grout joints don't crack when somebody slams a door or when somebody bumps the wall or leans up against the wall. So when a tile contractor arrives at a job, typically the wall is already boarded up by the carpenters, right? So we don't know if the studs are 24 inches on center, if they're 16 inches on center, and I don't have the metric equivalents for those, Ryan, but...
You don't need those for that. You need them for the size of the tile. That's it.
Right. We just know that it's a wall. All right, so the one kind of unofficial test is we lean against, the installers will lean against the wall and see how it flexes. And if it flexes like a trampoline, they should, what a responsible tile setter will do is they'll bring it up. They'll bring it up to the general contractor or the home builder. They're saying, hey, you know what, I kind of played around with the wall and got a little bit too much bounce back, and I don't know that we'll have a successful tile installation. And it's not because of me, it's because of what my material is going on. All right, so rigidity is important. L over 360 is the number, the unofficial number, and that's the L is the span over 360 is the height for maximum deflection. Okay, so if we're using steel studs, they need to be a 20 gauge stud and not a 22 gauge, not a 24 gauge. With stud gauges, with metal gauges, the lower the number, the thicker the gauge. Right? So we're looking for a thick gauge stud. We have to space those studs no farther apart, according to ANSI, than 16 inches on center. Okay, and then the backer boards would be applied in a horizontal orientation, staggered with a small gap between the boards. So these are some baseline rules on backer boards for tile. So let's talk a little bit about flatness. We need to have a substrate that's flat. Why? Because if we don't, we could have excessive lippage. There are a lot of things. I'm not saying flatness, floors that are not flat are the only thing that contribute to lippage. I mean, there are other things, like Ryan said, warpage of the tile, inherent warpage of the tile. Architectural lighting that really doesn't do the tile any favors can really exaggerate the lippage. So lippage is a concern, but we can mitigate that by having flat substrates. So that's something we can control. So a flat substrate will also help us obtain better coverage, better bond. When I say coverage, I mean how the mortar grabs onto the tile and how that same thin set mortar grabs onto the substrate. We're looking for a really good bond, and we need to have a flat substrate to achieve that bond. Okay. So how flat is flat? Well, there's two sets of numbers. For tiles that are smaller than 15 inches, that substrate needs to be no more than 1/4 of an inch and 10 feet from variation from the required plane, with no drastic drop-off of more than 1/16 of an inch in 1 foot. For tiles that are larger than 15 inches, which is, let's face it, much of the tile we use is going to be larger, those rules get twice as strict. It's 1/8 of an inch and 10 feet maximum variation, or 1/16 of an inch and 2 feet for drastic changes in plane. So graphically, that's what that looks like for a wall. The example on the left being for larger tiles, the example on the right being also for larger tiles with a drastic change in plane. And here we see a few things going on. And I have this slide in this section to show you all that patching material that is filling in the low areas of the backer board so that very large gauged porcelain tile panels will have a flat substrate to stick to. So I want you to see I'm just going to go off on a slight tangent because we do have some time. You see the patching. You understand we're filling in the low areas to make that substrate flat. And by the way, this is a crew of tile setters. These are not some special trade that comes in to fix the substrate. Remediating the substrate is one of the many, many tasks that tile setters do aside from actually laying the tile. So look at the gauged porcelain panel. This is the lamina technology that Ryan talked about, these 10 or 12 foot tall pieces of tile. This is obviously an exterior, so we can use tile on exteriors. This is just, I think, a great example of a lot of things, including substrate flatness. So the same, we've been talking about walls for the past couple slides, but those same numbers are true for floors, 1/4 of an inch and 10, or 1/8 of an inch and 10 when your tile is larger than 15 inches. So back to what we require of a good qualified tile setter is that person has to be able to evaluate the flatness of the substrate that they didn't put in, and they need to look at it. Is it acceptable for the tile? And 99 times out of 100, it is not acceptable. It doesn't meet those flatness criteria. So floor prep is a very, very important part of the trade. So not only does a tile setter have to be able to assess what's there, they have to be able to remediate it. And that's done either with a trowel-applied patch of sand and cement, like you see in this example. It could be done if it's concrete, not very commonly, but you could grind down the high areas. That's a little bit more labor-intensive than filling in the low areas. But it all depends on, if you need to hit a certain elevation or if there's a fixture or something, a curtain wall system that requires a certain floor-to-ceiling structural height. So here's the sand and cement patch, or the example on the left here is an alternative way. We used to call this self-leveling underlayment, and I think the ANSI committee has agreed to call it now a flowable hydraulic underlayment, because self-leveling is a misnomer, and you have to push it around with a squeegee, and you can't just pour a bucket on the floor and expect it to go where it needs to go. So we debate words in the ANSI committees. So let's talk a little bit about, assuming now that we've addressed the substrate, we have to make sure that the tile sticks to the substrate. Right? We have to make sure that this does not happen. This is bond failure. The example on the left is a tensile bond failure because that mortar has failed in tension because the gravity of the tile wants to work against the adhesive of the mortar. And overhead applications and overhead failures are very dangerous, but more commonly we have the example on the right, which is a failure in shear. Okay. Both of these have been spot bonded, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. You can probably know already, but So shear forces exist in walls where the tile wants to slide down, or in floors where the tile, where you have deflection of the structural slab, and the tile there are shear forces working against keeping the tile stuck. All right. So our goal as architects and designers and installers is to make sure that tile stays stuck. So we need to have three things: a really good substrate, a really good tile, four things: a really good mortar, and a really good installer. Okay. How much is that bond strength? It's 50 psi is the required bond strength for mosaic tile, for quarry tile, for pressed floor tile, for glazed wall tile, for porcelain tile, for glass tile, for stone tile. It's always 50 psi. Okay. And that's a pretty low number. I would be very surprised if you tested at something that was less than 50 psi. So how may a tile assembly fail? It may fail in one of a number of different ways. Unless it's a very, very brittle tile, you're probably not going to have cohesive failure of the tile, but you could. Okay. The next three are where we see most failure. When we see failures is where we see them. Adhesive failure between the tile and the adhesive. Okay, so you have to have compatibility. Typically, if the back of your tile is dusty, it should be wiped off. You know, you want something to stick the mortar to, not other than dust. The mortar itself could have failure in cohesion, or there may be an adhesive failure between the mortar and the substrate. And in some occasions, if the substrate is not a suitable substrate, the substrate itself could fail. So these are what we're trying to avoid, and like I say, it's not that difficult. You just have to have good quality assurance in the design phase and good quality control when the project is executed. So one of the most basic ways we can achieve good bond is by adequate coverage. Coverage implies mortar coverage and embedment. All right, I've been promoting to change the term coverage to coverage and embedment, and I think people look at me funny because it's too many words, but you can have 100% coverage, but if you don't embed the tile in that 100% of mortar, it's not really considered 100% coverage. So what the ANSI standards tell us is that 95% coverage and embedment is required for tile laid in wet areas. 80% coverage is the minimum coverage that we need for tile in non-wet areas. Now this slide will clarify what I mean by embedment. There's plenty of mortar in each of these examples, but it was troweled differently. So the example on the left, the mortar was troweled on in all different directions, and this is a piece of clear plexiglass that we're just using in lieu of the tile so we can see what's happening. We use this as a training exercise in our training center so that the apprentices can see what we want to have, and is the example on the right, is we want those ridges of mortar between the valleys to collapse into the valleys so that all that mortar just smushes, to use a technical term, smushes down, and that tile literally gets sucked in, all right? And that cannot happen physically if you're troweling in multiple directions. And for large tiles, for larger than 15 inches, it's best to trowel in the direction parallel to the short side of the tile, because those shorter mortar ridges are going to be easier to collapse than like a 4-foot long ridge. I'd rather collapse a 2-foot, or in this example, a 12-inch long ridge than a 24-inch long ridge. Okay. And this is what we mean by spot bonding, and sometimes this is done by installers who want to not struggle with having maneuvered the tile in place. They want to be very easy to lay the tile in place. So, and this is wrong. Under no circumstances should this ever be done. Unfortunately, we do see it done by installers who haven't been trained or who maybe don't care, and I hope they haven't. I hope everybody cares, but so let's say they haven't been trained. So the problem is here, you're not getting 80% coverage. You're not getting certainly 95% coverage. You're getting about 10% coverage because the only contact that tile is having with the substrate is at those 4 corners in the center. And you've got a lot of voids underneath. So we're back to the picture of the failure because this was applied in a spot bond, and thank God there's a canopy there. And in this case, the owner had a very creative solution to fix this problem. The owner put up a sign. Yes.
So this will lead us in quite nicely into the qualified labor discussion. And so, of course, as we've all mentioned, it is always great to be working with qualified installers to ensure perfect, beautiful end result to your project. So this is a great quote from the TCNA handbook on qualified labor. Because tile is a permanent finish, the lowest bid should not be the driving factor, but rather who is the most qualified to perform the scope of work specified. So that just really hits. And you want the most qualified person doing your job. So when it comes to specifying from a design standpoint, you now have to get the set of drawings together that are going to go to your installers to be able to start working on that. And of course, you're always going to include a couple of key things. The floor plan with the tile layout. If it's a bathroom, you've got your shower floor, you've got your main flooring. If it's an entire home or commercial space, you might have, in a larger space, you might have several different floor tiles. So really detailed on that floor plan. I think, for me, sometimes just a very basic layout is great, but giving as much information as possible, letting the tile size in the key, tile size, manufacturer, model, all of that info. It's best to have more than less, always when it comes to your tile plans. For the wall elevations, it's the same thing.
If I can add quickly, just in addition to all of those, dye lot or shade is also really, really important to have on the plans if you can, because that lets your contractor double check that before installing the product.
Absolutely. You always want to safeguard everything with that. And in the event you need to order more down the road, you know specifically which dye lot you're looking for. So thank you, Ryan. And then calling out any detail on the finished edges. So in those elevations, if you're using a finished edge on the piece, if you're mitering that edge, all of this stuff really needs to be detailed. You never want to leave it up to chance. You want the installer to have as much information as possible. I also sometimes will take it one step further. Even if it's a set of CAD plans, I will print it separately. On residential projects, this really works well because they might have it put up on the walls. They could see it. I highlight additional things. We color code specific things. When there's an edge profile being used, I mean, it's drawn so small in scale at the CAD, it might be 1/8 of an inch. And even though it's being called out with a note, I want it to jump off that page. I want whoever's looking at it to see it. And so CAD drawings tend to look beautiful, right? And I think often because they look so beautiful, sometimes there's little details that we really want to call out for every set of trades that's working on the project. So I really personally like to go over that, highlight it, color code it, just let it stand out. And then including, we talked about the tile size and all of that, and more is always better than less. So what also can be provided? So we talked about the detailed plans. For me, it's always key to have those on-site meetings as well when you're about to start that tile layout. We've talked about mock-ups and things like that. I also sometimes will provide samples, again, for color matching to make sure when that delivery happens, we always check before it goes in. We always want to make sure if it's not us, we're sending either a sample piece, making sure things are being checked. You want to make sure the right product is also being installed and that everything is correct on site. So we always do a pre-site meeting to check our materials, go over any mock-ups with the installer. If we have a sample piece as a control, sometimes we'll also bring that and make sure that there's no issue there. This was a bathroom that I had designed that actually had 5 different colors of grout used in this small little space. So here the detailed plans and the colored plans were very necessary. We had 4 alone on the floor, and on the wall there was an additional 2. We had fluorescent yellow. It was made to look like a football field for kids' baths. So we had a goalpost around the window that was fluorescent yellow, and all of these grout colors were custom. So it was very important to have it called out. But whether you're doing something with a lot of colors or not, your grout also needs to be labeled. If there are multiple areas of grout, again, it might be in a key, it might be in a legend, it might be somewhere on the plan, but it's always good to really highlight those areas, show where it's going to change, and really make that visible. Here on the right was the mock-up we were trying to get where we wanted to mark out where those hash marks were going to be. Even though sometimes your plans will show one thing, on site, anything could be a little bit different, could be an inch off, and all of those things you want to make sure it's going to be right. At this point, we're also meeting to go over where those cuts might be. Oftentimes on our drawings, as designers, I've always put a separate note that actual job site conditions and talking with the installer may dictate the final kind of where those cuts are going to be. So we put a specific note because sometimes things might change on site. We will have that discussion. Maybe it's drawn like this, but we want to know what's going to be the best way to do it. You have to lean on the experts. As designers, we're going to specify and talk about what we want. We need to talk with our installers and find out what's possible, what's capable, what might be best. So I often will always kind of, we might revise that final plan sometimes if it's an elevation for a bathroom or residential project, something smaller where there's a lot of detail. We will go over it and make sure we're doing that exactly as it should be done. This is the finished product here. It was a lot of grout, a lot of color, a lot of tile. But for me, I think it's always fun to be able to have fun with your tile and never be afraid of using multiple materials, multiple colors, multiple grout colors, all of that. So, and then for stuff more subtle, even in this bathroom here had 3 different types of tile, but again, as small as a simple bathroom plan, the details are really big. It's not just basic, you're leaving it up to chance if you're not doing all of that. Qualified labor is a big part of the equation, but providing them with the proper set of plans and the proper information is the other part of that. We have to work together to ensure beautiful results. And now I will turn it back over on where to find qualified.
So we've heard the term qualified labor, and that sounds real good, but what is it beyond rhetoric? Well, we'll learn on this slide what that means in this next set of slides. In about 2016, Tile Council and all the members of Tile Council, we made a very concerted effort to define what qualified labor was. And there's not just one thing that qualified labor looks like. There are a number of programs, training programs, certification programs, qualification programs that tell us the level of qualified labor. So what we have in the handbook today are examples of programs that would indicate these are qualified installers. And the first one is Journeyman Tile Layer Apprentice Programs, recognized by the U.S. Department of Labor, that the unions provide. The International Union of Bricklayers and Allied Craft Workers is the tile union. Right? Tile and marble are allied crafts of the bricklaying trade. So the International Masonry Institute, that's my organization, we run the apprenticeship and training on behalf of the Tile Setters Union nationwide. So that is in the handbook as an indicator of quality. Contractor College is a continuing ed program for tile contractors. Both the National Tile Contractors Association and the Tile Contractors Association of America, those are the 2 national associations, have best practice designations for their members. It's Trowel of Excellence for TCAA, and it's 5-star for NTCA. And those are great programs, both of them. At the pinnacle of qualified labor is the advanced certifications for tile installers. So whereas the 5-star and the Trowel of Excellence are certifications that are assigned to the contractor, that is to say, the company, the ACT are certifications that are assigned to the individual installers. So we're going to show you examples of that. Here's some language from MasterSpec, and if you don't know, MasterSpec is the subscription-based specifications service that's affiliated with the AIA that many large architecture firms subscribe to, and they take language from this MasterSpec template and they adapt it to their projects. We love what we being the whole tile industry, love what MasterSpec has put in their installer qualifications. They've got 4 options, and when you're an architect or anybody writing a spec, you can pick and choose which one of these to put in your project spec. You don't put all 4 probably, but you can choose what you want. So look at item number 4. Installer, that is the installing contractor, employs at least one lowercase installer, that's the worker, for the project that has completed the ACT for installation of any one of the 7 programs. So the ACT are actually a group of 7 different skill areas, which I'll go into in a moment. Here is a project spec that says essentially the same thing, but they're calling it out. They're saying completed the ACT certification for installation of membranes and shower receptors. Now, I don't know anything about this project, but I'm guessing that it has a lot of showers, and the membranes are very important, those 2 things, all right? So this is good. This is what we want to see in the specifications. This is an important slide because it illustrates not only the certifications, which I'll bring in, but the organizations at the bottom of the screen is all-inclusive. All right, this is everybody in the tile industry. The CTEF is the training arm of the non-union segment of the industry, whereas the International Masonry Institute is my organization, the training arm for the union portion of the industry. I've already told you about NTCA and TCAA, the two contractor associations. I've mentioned International Union of Bricklayers and Allied Craft Workers as the labor union for tile. And the TCNA, you probably know it for the handbook, the TCNA handbook, but the TCNA, the Tile Council, also is the organization that represents the tile manufacturers and suppliers and membrane manufacturers and setting materials and grouts. So this is everybody in the industry. And we speak with one voice, not always. We have our own interests individually, but when it comes to qualified labor, we really, really do speak with one voice. And the conclusion that we have arrived at a few years ago, and we've really built on this, is that there are 7 activities that a tile setter does, whether union or non-union, that they better be good at, and they better be well-trained, and not only do we train them respectively within our associations, but we test them. So we train them first, and then we test them on large format tile, number 2, membranes, number 3, mud walls, which is a mortar bed wall, number 4, mud floors, number 5, showers, and there are 3 Tile Council shower methods that we train and certify. Gauge porcelain tile, which is the lamina ultra-large format, and grouts. So what we're saying is out of the hundreds, if not thousands of tasks that a tile installer does every day, these are the 7 that they should be impeccable at if they want to, at least if they want to become certified. How many of these have the word tile? Or how many of these involve laying tile? Well, large format tile and gauge porcelain tile. Right? The other 5 we don't even use any tile, okay? So I want you to understand that a qualified tile installer has to have a lot of proficiencies before they even put tile in, okay? So how does an individual become certified in one or more of those certifications? 3 criteria. Number 1, they have to have years of experience in the field. They can't be brand new in the industry. So if they think they have the experience, they schedule themselves for a test, a written test, and that's number 2. They are tested on the TCNA handbook and the ANSI standards for tile installation. They don't have to memorize the information in those books. You don't have to memorize. And I'm on the committee, and I don't have the information memorized. But what I do know how to do, and what I encourage you all to know how to do, is to navigate your way. First of all, get the books. All right. So step 1, buy the books. Step 2, thumb through them. Learn what type of information is in them. And if we know, we certainly should expect the tile installers to know the information in their own reference books. All right. Up until recently, believe it or not, this was a rare thing. But now we've made great strides. So, and then if and only if they pass the written test, it's an open book test, by the way, on those reference manuals, then they sit for a hands-on examination, and it could be anywhere between 4 hours and 6 hours long, depending on what they're testing, whether it's showers or gauge porcelain or whatever, under the observation of a qualified evaluator who rates them on skill areas. So on the test for large format tile, the installers are evaluated on their ability to assess the flatness, to fix the flatness of the substrate, to spread the mortar in the right direction, to get good coverage, that 85% coverage that we talked about, to have minimal lippage. I think Ryan talked about the 33% offset bonding, so no 50% offset bonding, but 33 is okay in this example because of the lippage. So, and that's only a handful. These are some of the critical points for large format tile. They don't grout this. They just fix the substrate and they lay the tile. For this is for membranes. The installers are tested on their ability to install a liquid applied membrane, putting it down to the proper wet mill thickness using a wet mill gauge. All right? You can't just paint on a membrane with a paintbrush or a paint roller and eyeball it and say, oh yeah, that looks like it's thick enough. I mean, it has to be, if the manufacturer says 40 mils thick, it has to be 40 mils thick. No thinner, and not thicker either. All right? So liquid membrane with anti-fracture fabric embedded, sheet membrane with the proper overlaps, and then there's something relatively new called single component membranes, which is a liquid without the fabric in it. Now, it's easy to apply membrane to a flat area. What's difficult or tricky is where that membrane returns up the wall, where that membrane, how it makes its way around pipe penetrations and into a drain. So these are very, very important. If you're specifying a waterproof membrane, the terminations are the key, right? So we test them on those critical skills. For floor mud and for wall mud, the installers are evaluated on their ability to provide a flat floor and consistently thick floor with proper overlaps of the wire mesh or the wire lath reinforcement, proper overlaps in the case of the wall of the cleavage membrane, which is the brown material, shingling that cleavage membrane. I don't know if we have a laser pointer, but that inside corner, there has to be a break in the mud because that's an expansion joint. We haven't talked about expansion joints today. This may be the first seminar that we haven't, because expansion joints and substrates, those are two areas that seem to go wrong a lot. But in any case, that inside corner, they're evaluated on their ability to keep that clean, to allow independent movement. Showers, there are hundreds or maybe thousands of ways to build a shower. There are a handful of them, I think about a dozen or so, represented in the TCNA handbook, and those are given numbers, B415, B421, etc. The B421C is a curbless shower. We're seeing curbless now not only for wheelchair accessibility, that's kind of what the reason why we began to have curbless showers, but also some residences, they just like to have curbless showers. Yeah. It's a cleaner look.
Huge
and
trend.
Yeah. So there are unique things. I don't have time to go through the critical points of showers, but there are more critical points in a shower installation than probably the rest of them. And then gauged porcelain panels. Forget everything you know about laying tile. If you're working with gauged porcelain panel, they're different tools. You cut the material differently. You move it around the job site differently. Yep. You cut into it differently, you grout it differently, it's different mortar, different embedment techniques. So this is a very, very specialized application, and it has its own certification. And then finally, grouting is the certification for the finishing trade. So there are tile installers and then there are tile finishers. Typically it's the finishers that grout the tile, at least in commercial jobs. Is all grout the same? No. There's cement grout, there's now improved cement grout, there's sanded and unsanded, there's epoxy grout, there's urethane grout, there's single component grout. And each one of those different grouts has to go in, requires a slightly different set of skills and different set of knowledge. So this is where we certify our finishers. So that's a lot of information, and we've got about 15 minutes left. This was intended to be, and we're not going to stretch it for the sake of stretching it, but...
No, you have to stay.
This was intended to be kind of a primer for, folks interested in tile essentials. So I hope we've at least educated you a little bit, and we'll take questions at this time. Yes? Yes, how do you find an ACT certified installer? There is a website that the industry has put together. So this is a non-proprietary website, and it's called tilecertifications.com. Tilecertifications.com. And through there, it launches into other pages where you can search by geography and by specialty area. Other questions? Cool. Well, I guess we're done.
Yeah, thank you guys very
Thank
much
you.
for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Enjoy the rest of the show.